Hello and welcome to Mr. Saucedo's YouTube videos. Today we're going to be talking about how do plants obtain and use energy. So one of the attributes that living things have are that they have to use energy, right? They have to obtain and use energy. So let's talk about plants. So something that you're probably already aware of, right? Plants use photosynthesis in order to make energy. Now you know that the energy source that all cells use is ATP. And as a byproduct of photosynthesis, they make sugar. So photosynthesis uses visible light, right, which is made up of many different colors. And so here is our visible light spectrum. So we have from 700 nanometers, that's like red, all the way to violet, which is about 400 nanometers. And you can see that it makes up a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of actual light that we can see here. So we also have, all these other forms of light, but visible light only makes up this tiny, tiny little fraction of the light spectrum. And if you're wondering what the other, forms of light are, they're ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, microwaves, all of that fun stuff that you probably remember from like 8th grade, right? So what about chloroplasts? So chloroplasts are the primary organelle that we're going to be focusing on here in plant cells, and they contain three types of pigment that are light absorbing molecules. And so pigments are light absorbing molecules. When we use the term pigment, a lot of times people just think of paint. Paint is a pigment. It absorbs particular wavelengths of light and reflects others. And that's the color that you actually see with your eyes, right? So here are the main pigments that we see in chloroplasts. So we've got chlorophyll A, and you can see here, chlorophyll A is this dark kind of green color. It absorbs mostly blue-violet right about here in this wavelength, and also red-orange light. Chlorophyll B absorbs almost entirely blue light. You can see it does absorb a little bit of, kind of reddish orange, but not as much as chlorophyll A. So we're just going to kind of say it absorbs mostly blue. And then carotenoids, which is where, the word carrot is in there. So that's probably kind of a key to what you can find with a lot of carotenoids in them. But they absorb mostly blue-green, and you can see it's almost entirely blue-green, and then nothing. They don't absorb anything else. And so the main question that people tend to have is, why do plants appear green, right? Well, the first thing you need to know is that pigments in plant cells absorb most of the other colors in the light spectrum. So you can see there's this big dead area right where we have green and we have yellow. And then there's a little bit of increase here, but it's almost entirely dead where green is. And that is the reason why plants appear green. In the fall, chlorophyll will break down and react with other chemicals, forming orange and red pigments, right? So the reason why in the fall are, the leaves change color and all of that stuff is because there are other colors there, the carotenoids, right? Um, and there are other colors, but it's just that when chlorophyll breaks down, we end up seeing a whole host of other pigments that aren't necessarily used in photosynthesis. So photosynthesis in plants occurs inside of the chloroplast, and there are two key parts that we need to be aware of inside of the chloroplast. So you can see that there's a lot of detail here. We only need to be aware of two parts, though. The thylakoid is the first one, and that's what contains the chlorophyll, okay? So that's the first part. And so you can see these little thylakoid, they look like little coins, kind of stacked on top of each other, and that's what we call the thylakoid inside of our chloroplasts. Stroma is the fluid. So there's really a jelly in here that is really hard to kind of picture, but you can kind of see they're trying to show that it's a little liquidy. And that is the fluid on the inside of the chloroplast. So the key parts of photosynthesis happen in the thylakoid and in the stroma. And so if you want to circle or label, that's the stroma, that's the important part. That's the thylakoid, that's the important part. Everything else, we don't care about. Photosynthesis does occur in two main stages. So we have the light-dependent reaction, which means that it needs light, right? And so that's when the chloroplast captures energy from sunlight. And that's kind of traditionally what we tend to think of when we're thinking of photosynthesis. So what do plants need in order for this reaction to occur? They need sunlight and they need water for this reaction. So that's the reason why you got to put your plants out in the sun. And you've also got to water them, because in order to do this portion of photosynthesis, those are the two things that are required. You need sunlight, you need water. We also have the light-independent reaction, and that's when chloroplasts use energy. I know that sounds weird, right? But they use the energy that they got from the previous reaction in order to make sugar. And so what do plants need for this? They need CO2. What do we breathe out? Mostly CO2. And so we form kind of that biogeochemical cycle, that kind of like that perfect symbiotic relationship by us producing the CO2 that is necessary, and animals producing the CO2 that's necessary for this portion of photosynthesis. So here's the other important part. So you can see that the light-dependent reaction, right, the first part that we were talking about, this is a summary of it. So we have water, okay? We have sunlight. The sunlight is, you can see it's like hitting the thylakoid. Water is going in, energy is being released, and oxygen is leaving. And so in the light dependent reaction, these are the important steps. Step one, okay, and there are 5 of them. Sunlight has to stimulate the pigments in chlorophyll. Secondly, electrons are going to be transferred within the thylakoid. Okay, the electrons that are being transferred are going to cause the following thing to happen. So 6 water molecules are going to break apart. 6 oxygen molecules are going to be produced, and we make some energy. We make 18 ATP along with 12 NADPH. Now, you don't have to know what NADPH stands for. You just need to know that ATP is an energy carrying device that all cells use, right? We already said that. NADPH is one that plants use. Okay, our cells do not use it. So we can't say all cells use, NADPH, but it's another energy carrying molecule in plants. It has some cool stuff it can do down the road. You're not an AP, so you don't need to know the details of that. Okay, what about the light independent reaction? So notice we have 6 carbon dioxides going in, and we are manufacturing a glucose molecule, a sugar, from that. So there are 4 steps in the light independent reaction, and sometimes it's called the Calvin cycle. Sometimes you'll still see it called that, especially in older books and older articles. So the first thing you need to know is that the 18 ATP and the 12 NADPH that we originally created from the first part is going to get transferred to the stroma, right? So we're talking about the fluid now. We're not talking about the thylakoid. The thylakoid was where the first part was happening because it has to absorb sunlight. We don't need sunlight for the Calvin cycle. So all that energy that was manufactured is going to go into that jelly-like fluid. CO2 molecules are going to be absorbed. Carbon is going to be bonded into a ring. We call that carbon fixation. And we manufacture a glucose molecule, and plants are going to store that as either starch or cellulose. So you might think, why are there 2 steps? Why can't it just do the first step, right? Well, if that were the case, right, if it were just to do the first step, it totally could, right? Plants could. They wouldn't really be able to photosynthesize very well, though, in the winter. And again, we're talking about, not near the equator. We're talking about near where we are. So they need to store energy. And if there's not a lot of light, they're not going to be able to manufacture, enough energy for themselves. So they store it as a byproduct of starch or cellulose. So every time you eat a potato, every time you eat a carrot, just keep in mind that that item that you're eating was the plant's way of basically storing energy for the winter or for a rainy day, and you're eating it. I wasn't trying to make you guys feel bad. So equation for photosynthesis. So what is the equation for photosynthesis? We've got 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O give us a sugar, that's glucose, and 6 oxygens. Next up, here is a summary slide of everything we talked about, right? So notice for the light-dependent reaction, these are our thylakoid. Light is hitting them and stimulating them. Water is going in, oxygen is going out. ATP is being manufactured, NADPH is also being manufactured. In the Calvin cycle, that's the light independent reaction. CO2 is going in and sugar is leaving. Every single one of those items is here in this diagram. All right, so what are the functions of photosynthesis? First and foremost, right, plants are producing sugar for themselves. It also so happens that we use that sugar, in order for us to get energy. So they also do that um, in order to get, I almost said like it's a nice thing, but we're eating parts of them. Um, that is not the intent, but that's part of the carbon cycle, right? Plants produce oxygen as a byproduct, and that is a waste product for them. Oxygen is not necessary for them. It's the equivalent of us breathing out CO2. They breathe out oxygen because it is virtually toxic to them. They don't need it. So they just get rid of it. It's a gas. They just, whatever, get rid of that. That's part of the oxygen cycle, right? And then plants help regulate the Earth's atmosphere by removing excess CO2. So CO2 that's in the air can be absorbed by plants, and that can get fixed into sugar. And again, carbon fixation is the term there, and that's part of the carbon cycle. So one of the great ways of combating climate change is if we are not, decreasing the amount of CO2 that's being manufactured, we could increase the amount of plants. And I mean, you need a lot of plants. Like the whole Earth would probably have to get covered in plants. But you get the idea, right? That they help to regulate the Earth's atmosphere that way.